Wela'liek. Thank you everyone for joining us today. It's the first in our Mi'kmaw-led conservation webinar series. My name is Nadine Lafort. I work as a communication and outreach manager at Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources based in Eskasoni First Nation. And I'm hosting this evening's webinar. So first thing, I'm just going to ask everyone to mute yourselves and just stay on mute for the webinar. And if you have questions, you can type them into the chat. And after Lisa and Tom have spoken, we'll have hopefully have a chance to get to respond to some of the questions. And then just so you know, at the end of the presentation, there'll be a door prize. So we'll be doing that at the end, and we'll be in touch with the winner. Well, we'll announce and then be in touch with the winner. I think to start out this evening, I wanted to introduce Albert and ask Albert if you would open us with a prayer. So for those of you who don't know Albert, Elder Dr. Albert Marshall is from the Moose clan of the Mi'kmaw Nation. He lives in the community of Eskasoni in Unama'ki, Cape Breton. Albert's a fluent speaker of the Mi'kmaw language, a passionate advocate of cross-cultural understandings and healing, and of our human responsibilities to care for all creatures and our Earth Mother. And he's a designated voice for the Mi'kmaw elders of Unama'ki with respect to environmental issues. He's the spouse of the late Merdina Marshall, the father of 6 children, the grandfather and great-grandfather of many, many more, and a friend to thousands. So thank you, Albert. It's our honor to have you join us this evening.
Thank you. Kuchino afakijino. Amishkara meri Wela'liek. Kilaranteji guru na wakisko kisiganamuya. Era mole meri wijne biskwantane. Era mole kelo kuruswan. Hankidas wan. Meri wijne min kuruswan dan nebi degela. Ahina mole. Wela'liek meri wikilaranteji guru na wakisko kisiganamuya. Aflachi. Aftante se ko kisibaneganamuya. Si tantel khamasale si tantel ortie. Wela'liek sila no kumana. Si tan ko pegis duksi. Ata ko kisigina muksi. Ahne mo kurani na muchimisi sortiu eskamna si negmo. So, grandfather, our creator, we ask you to look upon us in a good way. We are here together to be of one heart, one mind, and one spirit, as you have intended for all your creations to be. In thanksgiving, we recognize that you have given us our minds, and so we are called upon to think and to use what has been given to us and help those who are in need. We are gathered here today so that we might gain knowledge that we need and which comes from beyond ourselves, that we need to consider the right things to do and to make right decisions wisely, to come to the right ideas and to share with one another the greatest gift of all, ourselves. We call upon the spirit of renewal and a spirit of healing that supports us on either side as we walk along the trail of life, that we may be renewed again as people, that healing be in our nations, in our communities, in our families, but most importantly, within ourselves. That as caregivers, we might find humility and have the wisdom within ourselves, the wisdom and strength to walk any path set forth by you, grandfather. As you gaze upon Mother Earth, you can see the spirit of life and how we are placed at the center of this life. That we follow this path that you, our creator, has chosen for us to follow with this kind of ever-seeing eyes, we too might understand our purpose and accept it to the fullest. As caretakers, we walk on this earth to be reminded that our path be one of love, understanding, compassion, healing, and thanksgiving. Today we stand together with one voice to ask for the blessing that we need to do the work that is yet that is ahead of us. And may the Great Spirit use use the sun to light the path for us to gain wisdom, knowledge, and patience. And may the Creator use the moon to give us peace, serenity, and knowledge and patience, so that we can gain strength, so that when our journey ends here on earth, like the fading snow, we can see each other with a straight eye and meet without shame. Nataliaj, Afshidum Snowma, and thank you.
Wela'liek, Albert. Thank you for getting,
Wela'liek, Albert. I'm sitting over.
thank you for getting us started on the right path and with the right words. I'd like to introduce our invited guests for this evening, Lisa Young and Tom Johnson, who will be introducing, kind of giving a big picture explanation of Indigenous-led conservation, and specifically Mi'kmaw-led. Lisa Young is the Executive Director of the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, UINR. Lisa joined UINR shortly after graduating with a BSc Biology from York University. Lisa served as one of the core members of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, which is called ICE, for the pathway to Canada Target 1. Lisa worked with ICE members on the production of a report called We Rise Together about achieving the pathway to Canada Target 1 through the creation of Indigenous, protected, and conserved areas in the spirit and practice of reconciliation. Lisa is now a member of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership Leadership Circle. This partnership project strives to implement recommendations from the document We Rise Together and to maintain the momentum created by the Indigenous Circle of Experts. Tom Johnson is the Executive Director of the Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission. He's a first language speaker and is a member of the Mi'kmaw community Eskasoni First Nation, which is the largest Indigenous community east of Montreal, nestled within one of the 7 traditional districts known as Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Eskasoni contains the largest number of First Nations Mi'kmaw, or first language speakers, so speakers of Mi'kmaw language. Tom has been instrumental in the regeneration of his first language. He has been involved in documenting a number of audio-video recordings which involved interviews with Mi'kmaw speakers, mainly elders. One of his current roles as co-founder for the Eskasoni Mi'kmaw Language Initiative has allowed him to plan 2 separate language conferences with his team members, one for youth and another for adults. Tom has worked tirelessly as an advocate for the rights and needs of Mi'kmaw people and continues to represent his people on several boards and committees. Tom presently serves as a member of the Executive Committee for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, a board member of the Bredor Lake Biosphere Reserve, and a member of the Canadian Biosphere Reserve Association Indigenous Circle. Welcome to you both, Lisa and Tom.
Thank you, Wela'liek. So I go first. I'm just going to try and share my screen, and just going to give it a shot. I hope it works. And here it goes. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
So Trish, I believe that's you who has to enable
Yep.
Tom's screen.
Yep,
share.
you should be able to share, Tom.
Okay, there we go. All right. All right, I'll try this.
We can see it.
You see it?
Yep.
Okay. Gelasi. You've heard that term before. In the Mi'kmaq culture, it goes way back, I guess, back to the days when we were living in the wigwams. And as you entered the wigwam, the host of the wigwam would tell you Gelasi. And the proper response to that would be Gedahamuk, meaning it looks quite comfortable. And if they tell you up Gelasi, you move up. And usually the most comfortable spot in the wigwam was opposite of the door. And once you've reached that spot, you were the honored guest. Then the traditional knowledge would start, and the dialogue, the teachings, and the storytelling. So I welcome Jilida. So here we are discussing the IPCAs, and it stems from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they were created in Aichi, Japan in 2010. And one of the things that we're looking at is Aichi Target 11. I'm trying to move, there we go. So Aichi Target 11 talks about land and biodiversity. How do we maintain biodiversity? And it was agreed that if we preserve 17% of the terrestrial and 10% of coastal marine areas, that we would maintain some sort of biodiversity. And when you think about biodiversity and indigenous peoples, it's an integral part of where we've come from, where we are today, and where we need to be. We need to reconcile with the land. And when you think about reconciliation, how do we maintain that reciprocal relationship, that two-way, it's a two-way street. And in terms of maintaining our biodiversity within these IPCAs, it's important that we keep respect at the core of our undertaking. Without respect, there is no relationship. When there is no relationship, there is no balance. And it's important that we maintain that philosophy when we think about reconciliation. And it wasn't that long ago that we were looking at 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was addressed in Canada. It was initially used to address the hardships that our people endured in the residential schools. But as these calls to action were being developed, more interest or information was relayed by Indigenous peoples in terms of what we need to reconcile with. And one of the things that is important when we think about reconciliation is our relationships on a universal level. And one of the things that we need to think about is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The 43rd call to action says we call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. Number 44 calls upon the Government of Canada to develop a national action plan, strategies, and other concrete measures to achieve the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In UNDRIP itself, there are 47 articles that talk about Indigenous, what we need to do to maintain some sort of relationship. It took 25 years in the making. And we, as Mi'kmaq, were very instrumental in developing those articles. In the late 70s, early 80s, we had an individual by the name of Saugage Henderson, who came to visit our annual St. Anne's mission and was introduced to the Grand Captain of the Sante Maui, or better known as the Grand Council of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And at the time, the Grand Captain said, "We've been trying to assert our rights in Canada, but Canada says we don't have these rights." And that's when the dialogue started with the UN. The Grand Captain, under the direction of the Grand Chief, instructed a lawyer by the name of Saugage Henderson to write to the UN and explain the situation that we were in as a nation. A lot of people were telling the Grand Captain at the time that you didn't have treaties. These treaties didn't exist. So in 1982, the Four Directions Council was formed. And we had two representatives representing the Mi'kmaq Nation. And those were, as I mentioned, Saugage Henderson and another individual by the name of Russell Barsh. So it took 25 years to produce this United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it wasn't only our people, the Mi'kmaq, that were experiencing these troubles by colonial governments. It was a lot of the indigenous people throughout the world. So the Four Directions Council was formed, and in 25 years later, in 2007, UNDRIP was developed. 144 states were in favor of the document. 4 states were against: United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And there were 11 abstentions. It's funny how these 4 states had the majority of indigenous people within their countries. In 2010, Canada issued a statement of support endorsing the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And in 2015, an NDP member of parliament by the name of Romeo Saginaw introduced a bill. And this would have required the Canadian government to ensure that the laws of Canada are in harmony with UNDRIP, but it was defeated on May 6, 2015. The concern there was Section 35 of the Constitution Act. They already had the Constitution Act, which is only a small paragraph in the act, whereas this 47 articles within this document were considered the minimum standards of what was required to maintain these indigenous groups throughout the world. In 2015, the Prime Minister of Canada asked the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs and other ministers in mandate letters to implement the declaration. And in 2016, a private member's bill was introduced in Parliament. And in 2016 again, the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs of Canada is now a full supporter without qualification of the declaration, and Canada officially removed its objector status. Now in 2018, it passed the House of Commons in May of 2018 and received royal assent. It wasn't passed at the time, but now it's under Bill C-15. And one of the things, as I had mentioned before, was about the minimum standards. It's Article 43 of the Declaration. The rights recognized herein constitutes the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. So when we think about these minimum standards, and we start out with the HE target 11, I think about where we're going, and one of the targets that I would like to mention is HE target 18. The traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous and local communities relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and their customary use of biological resources are respected, subject to national legislation and relevant international obligations, and fully integrated and reflected in the implementation of the convention with the full and effective participation of Indigenous and local communities at all relevant levels. So that's what we're undertaking now. We're in negotiations or in discussions with provincial governments, municipal governments, First Nations governments, and federal governments to start the process of the Indigenous protected conservation areas. And one thing to keep in mind is that these are Indigenous-led. Thank you. Wela'liek. And just in reference to this logo or the coat of arms, it's a traditional, goes back to the 1600s. And you'll see we have a, I'm pretty sure it's a Mi'kmaw person there, and but now things have changed and we don't have that anymore. It would be nice to maybe bring it back. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that. What Tom shared is an important background information to understanding the concept of IPCAs. And I'm going to circle back later to some of the things that he shared and why it's so relevant and important in understanding advancing Indigenous-led conservation in those contexts. So I always appreciate when our elders are with us, and especially Albert Marshall. I've learned so much from him in my whole career working at UINR in terms of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous-led conservation. So I know in talking to a lot of elders across Canada during the ICE process and at other tables and even around the world, our elders are reminding us that we are in an ecological crisis. So Tom mentioned the concerns that Canada has around biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And our elders have been telling us that for years, that we were in a crisis, that we were on a bad path, and that something needs to be done. So our environment, I think you would agree, just with this past year, even with Nova Scotia, what the weather's been like is a really good indication of this, that our environment is changing at a rapid pace. and not even just from climate change, but concerns around urban sprawl and resource extraction. All of these pressures are causing this decline of biodiversity. Animals, they have a natural ability to adapt. The world naturally does change and evolves, and nature changes and evolves with it. But it's through our constant need for growth that has impacted the health of these species. So this habitat destruction and degradation has really crippled the ability for our nogama is what Albert and our elders call it, our relations, these species, to adapt. And climate change has only exacerbated this. And this is the extent of the crisis. Nothing seems to be improving. So despite our efforts, are the efforts of our government and scientists over the years to improve biodiversity, they have been failing. There's the movement to rectify that, as Tom alluded to, with the Aichi targets, and then what have actually translated to Canada's target 1, to increase land protection, to improve biodiversity. So it's, I think now 25% inlands and waters by year 25, and 30% by 2030. Those are the targets. That's the aspiration of what we're going to do. And the thought behind that is if we just put aside enough land and conserve enough land for these species, that somehow we're going to solve the issue around biodiversity. But what our elders tell us, what our knowledge holders have told us, and what our Indigenous knowledge is telling us, and evident through our failures, our past failures over the years, this idea, this Western kind of centric idea of that you can protect land from ourselves by removing the human element from the land, that somehow that's going to protect the species. So the idea of protecting nature by removing humans and then taking a business as usual approach everywhere else has proven to be, it's not effective. Indigenous people are the original caretakers of these lands. So these concepts that have become coined now in the environmental sector around sustainability and holistic management, these aren't just concepts for our Indigenous peoples and our First Nation communities. These are a way of life. So for thousands of years, these lands have sustained our nations, and yet they were still a very much thriving, healthy ecosystems. So imagine that. In the past, we were able to sustain all these different nations across Canada and the US and around the world and in other Indigenous lands. And to think you would look at the lands, they were still pristine. They were still thriving. So these lands were actually shaped by our relationship to the land. They were our own values and belief systems were our management plans. And I use quotations for management plans because our elders will tell us, and Albert will tell you, that we don't manage the land, but we can manage our own actions. And I was listening to Albert's prayer, and there's so much wealth of knowledge in those thoughts that he shared. Everything that I know that we need, or we speak of, that we need to advance Indigenous-led conservation are in there. The acknowledgement and respect of the species that are our relatives. He spoke to that. The importance of protecting them, their value, he spoke to that. The ideas of the importance of our culture, our language, in protecting that, and how that shapes our relationship to the land. He spoke of, in you can hear it in his words, about the love and reciprocity and respect. That's speaking to reconciliation. Tom talked about that and the importance that plays in providing space for Indigenous-led conservation. So those concepts, they may be ancient concepts, but they're still very relevant in today's society, today's world. So even though Canada's landscape may have changed, these core concepts that our elders share are really still the key to creating that paradigm shift that Canada needs to bring our species back from the brink of collapse. Those Western ideals and concepts around species protection and land conservation, they're flawed. And it's evident they're flawed because of the position we are in today. Those teachings our elders have can very much be applied in a modern day context. What I said before, when our elders come and they share these prayers at the beginning of these meetings and our sessions and the knowledge that they're sharing, they're not just nice thoughts or concepts. They're directions. They're telling us how we as humans need to walk on this earth to ensure that we have a sustainable future, that we have our resources are protected for 7 generations, that we are intricately tied to this earth and all species on this earth. Their future is our future. Their health is an indication of our health. And if that's true, then there's a problem. So when you look at biodiversity, there's often, and it's proven and shown, areas of high biodiversity in Canada, the ones that are still there, are very much often linked to areas that are managed by Indigenous people. There's a positive correlation between Indigenous managed areas and high biodiversity. And then there's also the idea that, as Tom alluded to, that our people have an inherent right to maintain this relationship to the land. And as Albert would tell us, we have an inherent responsibility that comes from that. This inherent right it's been confirmed by our treaties and is upheld by our treaties and protected under the Constitution of Canada. So not only do we have the right to exercise our responsibilities for these lands, and Albert would say a moral obligation to do so, we have a legally protected right to do so as well. And First Nations have been, like I said before, we are the first stewards of these lands, and we have been managing and protecting these lands for thousands of years. So IPCAs is not a new concept per se. Indigenous protected and conserved areas speaks to a modern day expression of these rights and responsibilities. So what they do speak to is they're a tool, and they provide the opportunity for Indigenous communities to lead conservation and protection efforts that are rooted in Indigenous law and governance. And they are also a tool for nation building, for strengthening Indigenous government, revitalizing language and culture, and reconnection to the land. Tom spoke a lot about language, and he spoke a lot about culture and reconciliation. And those are important concepts because our culture and our language is what intricately ties us to those lands and shapes and how we live on that land, how we interact with that land. And that's so important for the concept of Indigenous protected conserved areas. Indigenous communities need that space, that ability to reinvigorate those traditional concepts around conservation. We need spaces where we can take the lead in conservation and have it grounded in all those ideals of our governance and of our law, and most importantly, our culture and language. So we always say that culture and language is at the heart of any IPCA. So IPCAs in that way are exercises in reconciliation. Because in order for an IPCA to be successful, Indigenous communities need to have that space to lead conservation. We talk a lot about ethical space in supporting IPCAs. And what ethical space asks of us, First Nations and non-First Nation communities, NGOs, universities, government, whoever is there who would like to support and contribute to the creation of IPCAs, is that we come into that space and it's a respectful space in that it acknowledges all those things that Tom talked about. The TRC, UNDRIP, treaty rights, the fact that Indigenous knowledge is recognized as a knowledge that's is equally important, and it holds it up in the same way as Western knowledge and science. That should be a given. All those things are not there to be negotiated. Those are truths. And if everyone comes into that space with that mind going forward, that those are stepping stones to move from, to create the opportunity for IPCAs, and that's what's needed for them to succeed. And just back to the idea of reconciliation, we talk about IPCAs not just there for reconciling Canadians and non-Indigenous people with our Indigenous peoples concepts and relationship building, but also there are opportunities to reconcile with the land. And sorry, I got distracted for a second. Someone came in, but that's pretty much it. That's the high kind of overview about the thought and the reasoning of why IPCAs are needed, and what they are. And we're going to talk a little bit more in future webinars about specifically what's an IPCA in the Mi'kmaq context, and what's happening in Nova Scotia, because IPCAs are Indigenous-led and grounded in Indigenous governance and culture and belief systems. As you can imagine, IPCAs will be different across Canada depending on what nation you're in, and they're very much shaped about from the land and the relationship with the land and what the land needs. So they'll be different for each province. And I don't know, I just wanted to go back to the moderator. If Albert has anything to add. Albert, it didn't say it in his introduction, but Albert is also a member of the Elders Lodge that advises the Conservation through Reconciliation Partnership on the creation of IPCAs. So Albert, I hope I did all your teachings some justice, but if you want to add anything to that,
Okay,
you're more than welcome.
let's see what is possible. It is possible to have a healthy environmental, and it is possible to have a healthy environmental and a healthy economy. It is possible to build incentives for a cleaner future. It is possible to have biodiversity, healthy human beings on the same planet. And it is possible to have a free market, scientific and technological advances, and an even more positive environmental outcomes. There is every reason to be optimistic that if we develop smart environmental and biodiversity policies, our children and grandchildren will experience an even more pleasant world. I think those are some of the things that are possible, providing we somehow adhere to some of those teachings that are consistently being shared by elders from all over the world. That's the only thing I would like to add.
Thank you, Albert.
Lisa and Tom, can we, well, at the beginning I mentioned that people could write in some questions in the chat. So if you have any, please drop them there and then I can forward them on to Lisa and Tom. There is a question here, Lisa, just asking if there's a link for IPCAs in Mi'kmaw-led. If you just want to sort of give the context of what is happening now, and I know that we'll get into the specifics in the next webinar, but maybe if you could just explain a little bit of sort of what is happening and where people might be able to find more information.
I'm trying to think of what is publicly available at the moment, but I can give a quick overview of what's happening in the Nova Scotia context. So we've been very fortunate in Nova Scotia in that our leaders have already been doing a lot to advance Indigenous-led conservation and treaty implementation in Nova Scotia. So under the lead of our the Nova Scotia Assembly of Mi'kmaw Chiefs, the 13 communities, we're pursuing a number of IPCAs in Nova Scotia. They all look very different. They all were brought forward for various reasons, because one of the things I guess I should have touched on in the conversation on IPCAs is that, again, kind of unpacking just things a little bit about Western perspectives around conservation and looking at areas of high biodiversity. IPCAs can be created for whatever reason the Indigenous communities need. So it's areas are identified not only for the biological diversity that's important, but they're also identified by their cultural and historical significance. And they also could be areas that are important for protection of cultural keystone species. So species that typically would not be in the government's radar because they're not considered species at risk, but they are very significant and culturally and spiritually for the Indigenous Mi'kmaq people. So there's a lot of areas that have been brought forth by all the communities across Nova Scotia that are under consideration for IPCAs. We have an advisory committee that's working on behalf of the Assembly, and that's comprised of UINR, EFWC, and CMM, which work on the mainland. And we're pursuing it in a number of different ways. We're looking at the establishment of a Mi'kmaq land trust for acquisition of private lands. We're in discussions with the province on various areas of Crown land that have been identified. Very early stages around that. There is community engagement is what's happening at this point. Because IPCAs, if you look at the ICE report, the We Rise Together report, it's very much a guidance document that tries to explain all the things I've talked about to government and others so that we can provide the space for communities to come in and establish their IPCAs and give them resources and kind of like encouragement, support, validation for the work that they're doing. So for Nova Scotia right now, we're in the process of working and engaging our communities and having them define what an IPC means for them. So it's very much from a community-driven perspective, because it's very much ingrained in our culture and perspective of Indigenous-led conservation. We're closely working with our communities to define the priority areas and the priority conservation approaches that we want to take for each area. So that's where we're at in Nova Scotia. There's not much right now that we have that we could publicly share, I don't think. other than to say that that's the process we're working on. There is a report from work that we've done. Trish, is that report up? Is that something that we have publicly shareable now?
Yeah, I
Yep.
just, oh, Megan is just, she's putting so I just posted that we could put the link to the We Rise Together document, and then also the Don Dello Dug report. We can put that up as well, and that's specific to Unama'ki, the report.
Yeah.
But and then the We Rise Together is not Mi'kmaw-led specific. It's across the nation, but across Canada. But people might find it interesting, and then that people will hear more as the IPCAs are being developed. So like Lisa said, there are several sites that have been identified, but it's too soon to pitch them as IPCAs or potential IPCAs.
Yeah, I don't know if Tom wants to speak to his. So UINR has kind of been taking the lead on working with the province in discussions around the Glooscap Wilderness area as an opportunity for Indigenous communities to co-manage that. The report that we're referring to is the report that was the very first engagement session we had communities on and what that might look like. It was more like a scoping discussion. Now, Tom, I don't know if you want to talk more about Eskasoni's work.
Sorry, yeah. So what we're doing in Eskasoni is we're looking at our watershed, and we've been experiencing water problems over the past 10 years in one of our major rivers. And the Eskasoni Band has spent over $1 million in repairing these homes and the river around that area. So when we did our investigative work a while back, and we found out that there was some clear cutting activity up within the watershed. So we formed a group called I hate to call ecosystem management. How can we manage an ecosystem? As Albert knows, in one of our meetings, one of our elders said we're doing a forestry management plan, and one elder said, we don't manage forests manage us. And when you historically think about it, that's how it operates. So what we're doing now is we're in the process of looking at different lands within the watershed, and the process has started. It's going to take a while, maybe a couple of years. We have different groups within our community, from a language group to resource users to, and the whole goal is to, as I said earlier, is to develop this reciprocal relationship with the land. Because a lot of what's out there in terms of the land, and I'm going to jump into a little bit of history of the land, is we live in a temperate climate here in the Atlantic provinces. And a lot of the forests have changed over the years. I guess I'll have to jump into some history and look at some fires that have happened in the past. In 1783, we had a number of loyalists come to shore, and they were granted land. And the fastest form of land clearing at the time was through fire. And given the right conditions, a dry summer, the fires got out of control. And we burnt Nova Scotia, 2/3 of the province burned down in 2 weeks. So whenever you clear land like that, you're going to get different types of species that come up. They're referred to as early successional species. And some of our traditional species that were dependent on old growth forests, such as the caribou, were no longer here, because the lichen that they require it takes between 80 and 100 years to produce in certain types of ecosystems. So, and again, I'll jump back to history. 100 years later, we had another fire in Nova Scotia. So a lot of the landscape has changed. And that's something that we're going to definitely consider when we're looking at our IPCA in terms of, I know we can't bring our traditional forest back in overnight, but we have to, what belongs to the land? What does the land want? And the only way we can determine that is if we look at the history of the land. It was interesting, one of the papers that I read was done by a archaeologist. It was, I forget her name, Elena Pomerenko. She's a archaeologist who looks at the soil. And I remember she was doing a dig around the Truro area. And she witnessed, she found some caribou tracks that were about 1,500 years old in the soil. It was a big path that the caribou herds just, went to back and forth, back and forth. So when we look at the land and what belongs here in terms of animals, trees, reconciliation, we have to look at what belongs to the land before the healing takes place. We were bombarded with a number of diseases, invasive species. I think the province, we're looking at about 30% invasive species now. And right in our backyard here in Eskasoni, we have the very strong American beech. We call it Somosi. It's a long-lived species. It's supposed to be around here for a long time. However, in recent years, it's been bombarded by the beech mining weevil. The beech is, it's not, it's had its share of luck, in the past. We had the beech bark disease before that. And I think the latest beech mining weevil was it originated overseas. It got on shore in Halifax, and that's where it was first spotted. And there was a lot of machinery being moved around the province. These bucks can also be carried in the wind. So right now, if I look out up the mountain, I see the beech. It's not in the greatest of health. Actually, I'll just say it's dying and it's dead. I didn't realize the condition it was in until I went into the forest this fall. It looked like it kind of reminded me of a graveyard. It was very eerie. I could hear the trees making the noise in the wind, almost on the verge of snapping. And, when these leaves appear in, some say banyach, when they bloom in the spring, or silk is another word, or nipk, meaning nibij, the leaf. The leaves take the chlorophyll and provide the energy to the tree. And when there's no leaves, when these leaves start appearing, the little bugs start eating them. And it's been ongoing for about 5 years now. So our beach is in a, well, it's dead really. I won't say it's in bad condition, it's dead. However, somebody told me, well, dying beach, maybe you're going to get more chaga, but that's sad when you look at it like that. So we have to look at those type of activities that have happened in the land. How can we avoid stuff like that? And how can we put something in that belongs to the land? And, one of the, we take it for granted, I guess. One of the most invasive species we have within our province are the grasses. We have various types of grasses. We have grasses from Kentucky. Bluegrass is a famous one that everybody likes. Everybody likes the lush green grass. And that's something we need to look at, what was here. How can we reintroduce species that belong to the land and within this climate, and start from there. Look into the past, assess our present situation, and plan for the future. That's it.
Thank you, Tom. That's really a great way to pull it all together. I would just maybe draw people's attention to the chat. A few questions were asked, and then Lisa and Patricia Nash is working with UINR on IPCAs, and they answered a few questions in there, and then several links have been posted for a few resources on IPCAs and Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership and other resources. So they're there if you'd like to get those links. And this webinar was recorded as well. So I think we'll be able to send this link to everyone. And we can also send those links to the resources if we can't access them in the chat. I'm not sure how it works after the webinar is complete. Thank you so much, Lisa and Tom and Albert, for sharing some of the big picture concepts of, to do with Mi'kmaw-led, Indigenous-led conservation, to do with Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And it really sets the stage for discussions with more details on what is happening. Obviously, several of the questions in the chat and that people were asking are really about like what's happening. We'd love to know more, and so that's really exciting, and we're excited to be able to share more in upcoming webinars. Maybe Megan, if you wanted to just mention, are we going to have a little draw now before we do the closing prayer, or?
Yeah, so I put everyone who's here, I put your name in a generator, and at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock exactly, sorry, I drew a name. And so our winner this week is Sandra. Now, I don't know what your email is, so if you could just message me here on Zoom's just to Megan, your email address, just so I make sure I have it right, and we will arrange the delivery of your prize.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you to all of you, Wela'liek, and I'm going to hand it over to Elder Albert, for a closing prayer before we all head our separate ways. Albert?
Kuttino, hakkitino. I'm scarameli with Wela'liek. Radigro nago kisku kisiginamwe. Wela'liek and melu is la radigro for crosswalk and kisiginamwe. Crosswalk and dane bidegal. Ahinamwe. Edamule melu is here within a winkelo for crosswalk and the hankidas one. Ahmugin awarmin kamlamuna. Ahnega Gulaman and Tankistil Maulopodi Disney. Tankistil Maui Abona Maruki Disney. Tankistil Maui Disney Tower kissing in a movie. Untitled det paradox desne. Untitled det parotesne. Ora mausit hamugoe. Muna nega mo inu da amigum sortin en tesigis. Antuji basip kiridas wadame. Munega mo itaji gekno. Mo kano wan kisedo. Mo kano ko kisedo. Era mo nega ina mun kano ko lankidas wan grus wan. Ora man kisi olo wattesne lantul wan. Ahtan kistil wefdesne tawa kisigina mo. Si tantil da ko na marokidesne. Tantil yang ko yarokidesne. Tantil sespedettesne. Tantil det parotesne. Rasit hamu. Tantil sibneg mo basit kilidas wadame. Ahnigeda teni mulega eda mulega melwi nega hewi na mun ulodi wantagodi. Raman kisi olo wattesne nantil wanga. Ahnega yagun abagona mun kisio se zarune. Sastu dia habik siktu. Raman krabis paso mau yabagona marokidesne. Mau lugu di desne. Mau sespedeto ki desne. Raman kishul det parotesne. Mau sit hamu goe. Nadliet.
Sitting on Wela'liek, Albert.
Wela'liek, Albert. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope that you can join us in 2 weeks for another discussion, this time into the specifics of IPCAs in Nova Scotia.
There's one more thing I would like to bring forth, Nadine. When we talk about IPCAs, we know that from our Aboriginal perspective, every land is sacred. And when we're talking about these sacred places, can we somehow find another word that would encompass that word sacredness? Because we don't want to make a point that only these places are sacred. But the point I'm trying to make is that every land is sacred. So is it possible for us to find another term, another terminology that will somehow be reflective of that idea that every land is sacred? And that's in reference to these Aboriginal protected areas. So that's just my idea of my question is it possible to find another Mi'kmaq term that would capture that essence of why these areas should be protected?
I think that is a perfect thing to bring into the next session, Albert. And maybe we can bring that question to the speakers and they can address it. And that can be kind of a launching point for discussing IPCAs and any kind of Indigenous like Mi'kmaw-led conservation in Nova Scotia. That's great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.